Welcome, dear listeners, to Whispers in the Dark, where shadows tell stories and the night breathes secrets. I'm your guide through the unknown, your storyteller in the silence, weaving tales that will haunt your thoughts long after the last word fades. Here, we embrace the eerie, the unsettling, the stories that lurk just beyond the edge of the firelight. So settle in, dim the lights, and listen closely. The darkness has something to say. So let's begin this horrifying tale, The Phantom Hunter. It was the first weekend of autumn, and Emily and Jake had decided to escape the city. The work weeks had been grueling, the constant hum of life pressing down on them like a weight they could no longer bear. They needed a break. The crisp air of the mountains, the cool whisper of leaves falling, the quiet solitude of the wilderness. It seemed like the perfect remedy. Or so they thought. The sun was beginning to set as they made their way deeper into the forest, the orange and pink hues of twilight casting long shadows through the towering trees. The road was narrow and winding, barely wide enough for their car, but they didn't mind. It felt remote, untouched. Emily had always loved the woods. Something about being far away from everything made her feel free. And Jake, Jake had grown up hiking and camping. He promised her that this would be a trip to remember. The forest stretched out around them in every direction, dense with pines and oaks, their branches tangled high above, blocking the sky. It felt like entering another world, a world where time didn't exist and nature held dominion. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, moss, and the distant aroma of wood smoke that carried faintly from nearby campgrounds. Every few moments, the car's headlights would illuminate a patch of the forest floor, where fallen leaves were strewn in a chaotic carpet of reds, yellows, and browns.
"This place is perfect,"
Emily said, glancing out the window, her voice light with excitement. Jake nodded, though his hands gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly. He couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping in at the edges of his mind. It was the silence that unsettled him, the kind of silence that made his ears ring. There was no chatter of birds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just the occasional creak of the trees swaying in the wind. It felt as though something was holding its breath, waiting. They reached the campsite just as the last traces of sunlight dipped below the horizon, leaving them in the embrace of twilight. The shadows of the trees seemed to grow longer with each passing minute, stretching across the forest floor like dark fingers reaching for them. Emily didn't notice the heaviness in the air, but Jake did. He could feel the weight of it, like a blanket pressing against his chest, but he shrugged it off. It was just his imagination, he told himself. Nature had a way of making everything feel more intense than it was. They unpacked the car in silence, the only sounds the crunching of gravel beneath their boots and the rustling of their gear. The campground was empty. No other campers, no sign of life except for the distant murmur of the creek they'd set up beside. A perfect escape, he thought again, shaking off the lingering unease.
"We should set up the tent near the creek,"
Emily suggested, already taking the stakes and poles out of the trunk. Jake hesitated, looking toward the creek, which wound its way through the trees like a glimmering snake in the dimming light. The water was dark, almost black. He could hear the soft gurgle of the stream, but beneath that, there was something else. A faint rustling, like something moving in the underbrush.
"Sure."
Jake said finally, trying to shake the thought.
"Near the creek it is."
They set up the tent quickly, their motions practiced. But as they worked, Jake couldn't help but notice the silence, the complete absence of sound. It was as if the forest had gone still, holding its breath, waiting for something. Emily, ever the optimist, didn't share his sense of unease. She hummed to herself as she hammered in the stakes, her laughter echoing through the trees. But Jake's mind kept wandering back to the strange stillness. He glanced toward the tree line, but it was impossible to see anything beyond the thick shadows. When the tent was finally set up, they both sat down by the campfire, the orange glow from the flames flickering across their faces. Jake poked at the fire with a stick, his eyes flicking from the flames to the dark woods beyond. He couldn't remember the last time he felt so on edge.
Maybe it's just the city getting to me.
Jake muttered to himself, but Emily, sitting beside him, raised an eyebrow.
What was that?
She asked. Jake glanced at her, startled out of his thoughts.
You've been quiet all night. You sure you're all right?
She asked, her voice soft but tinged with concern. He smiled, trying to mask the tension in his chest.
Yeah, just tired. Been a long drive.
She smiled back, but her eyes narrowed slightly, as if sensing something wasn't quite right.
Well, let's enjoy it. No work, no stress, just us and the woods.
Jake nodded, forcing a smile, but as he looked at her, a cold shiver crawled down his spine. Something was wrong. He couldn't explain it, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left him since they'd arrived.
Maybe it's the woods.
He murmured.
It feels different here.
Emily laughed, leaning into him.
It's just your imagination. We're in nature, Jake. Relax.
But the laughter sounded hollow, even to Jake's ears, as if the forest itself was listening. He shook his head, trying to push the thought away. They sat in silence, watching the fire crackle and pop, its warmth barely reaching them as the wind began to pick up. It carried with it a chill that seeped into their bones, making the flames feel like nothing more than a distant memory. Suddenly, there was a sound, a soft, unmistakable rustling from the woods behind them. At first, Jake thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, louder this time, the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. He stood, instinctively reaching for the flashlight at his side.
You hear that?
He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily looked up, brow furrowed, her eyes scanning the trees.
It's probably a deer, maybe a bear, but bears don't usually come this close, right?
Jake swallowed, tightening his grip on the flashlight.
Not usually.
But this didn't sound like a deer. This was something far heavier, something with weight. The branches overhead creaked in the wind, and the forest seemed to groan under its own weight, like it was alive, restless. Another rustle, this time closer. Jake shone the flashlight into the dark, the beam cutting through the misty air. The light flickered, and for a brief moment, he saw movement, something massive moving in the distance, just beyond the trees.
Emily, get back in the tent.
He said, his voice suddenly tight with fear. His pulse raced.
What is it?
She asked, her voice shaky, but her curiosity had already overtaken her fear. She stood, her gaze following the beam of the flashlight into the darkness.
Just get inside. Now.
Emily's eyes widened, the first true hint of fear crossing her face as she turned to retreat into the tent. But it was too late. The growl that rumbled from the woods was deep, unnatural. It sounded like nothing they had ever heard before. The noise reverberated through the trees, a sound so primal, so terrifying, that it froze them both in place. The forest was no longer silent. It was alive with the sound of something monstrous, something that wasn't supposed to exist. Jake's breath caught in his throat as the trees around them shook, the ground beneath their feet vibrating. The air was thick with tension, the smell of damp earth mixing with the sudden putrid scent of decay. The rustling stopped, but the silence that followed was even more unnerving. Hearts pounding, Emily and Jake exchanged a look of dread. Without a word, they slipped into the tent, each step heavy with the weight of unspoken fear. and zipped it shut, as if that thin fabric could keep the darkness at bay. Emily woke with a start, her heart pounding in her chest. The familiar sounds of the forest had faded into an eerie silence, broken only by her own shallow breathing. She lay still for a moment, eyes wide in the dark, listening for something, anything. The night had swallowed up the camp, and all that remained was the feeling of being trapped in a place that had suddenly turned too quiet. Something wasn't right. Jake, still asleep beside her, stirred slightly, but didn't wake. The rhythmic rise and fall of his chest seemed oddly comforting, but Emily couldn't shake the unease coiling in her stomach. She turned her head slowly, eyes scanning the interior of the tent. The shadows were thicker than usual, like the very fabric of the tent had absorbed the darkness outside. The air felt heavier, more suffocating, and she couldn't help but notice that the temperature had dropped significantly. A soft rustling noise from outside the tent made her freeze. It wasn't the wind. No, this was deliberate. Something moving, something with weight. The quiet of the forest had returned, but this was different. This wasn't the normal silence of the woods at night. It felt like the calm before the storm. Her breath hitched. She sat up slowly, careful not to wake Jake, though the temptation to shake him awake was strong. She reached for the flashlight, its cold metal handle familiar in her grip. She flicked it on and shone the beam toward the tent flap. Nothing, just the deep blackness of the forest, the trees standing like silent sentinels, their shapes barely discernible against the sky. But then she saw it, just a flash of movement. It was too quick, too fast to be a deer, but the shape was large, hulking. She blinked, her heart racing. The beam of light flickered as the flashlight's battery dimmed, and for a moment, Emily felt the weight of that darkness closing in around her. She whispered urgently. Jake groaned but didn't open his eyes. He mumbled something incoherent, clearly still deep in sleep. She glanced toward the entrance of the tent again, her eyes wide, straining to see through the thick layers of darkness outside. The growl she had heard earlier, the low, guttural rumble, was back, only this time it sounded closer, more menacing. Her skin prickled as the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. The sound was deep, primal, like something hungry, something that had been waiting for the right moment. She pulled her knees to her chest, trying to push back the terror clawing at her throat. This wasn't normal. Bears didn't act like this, didn't stalk humans this way. They stayed away from campsites, didn't approach tents in the middle of the night, circling and growling like predators. Jake stirred again, a soft groan escaping his lips as he stretched. He mumbled,
You're acting paranoid. Just go back to sleep.
Emily swallowed hard, trying to calm her breath.
Jake, listen.
She said, her voice cracking slightly.
There's something out there. Something huge. It's not right.
Finally, Jake's eyes fluttered open, though they were bleary with sleep. He turned to face her, squinting in the dim light.
What do you mean, something huge? It's probably just a bear, Emily. They're everywhere out here. They won't bother us.
Emily shook her head.
No, this isn't like any bear I've ever heard.
Jake sighed and rubbed his face, clearly irritated.
You're overthinking it. It's just a bear. They've been known to come near campsites, but as long as we stay inside the tent, we'll be fine. Now get some sleep.
But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She clutched the flashlight tightly in her hands, her pulse quickening with every beat. The growl came again, this time much closer. Her eyes widened as she heard something massive moving through the brush just beyond the tent. The trees shook slightly, as if something heavy had brushed against them. And then she heard it, a snap, sharp and violent, like the breaking of a tree branch. She stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. Suddenly, with a horrifying clarity, the smell hit her. It was putrid, decay, something rotten, something dead. The scent was so overpowering that she gagged, her stomach turning. It was the kind of smell that clung to the back of your throat, suffocating you. Emily's eyes darted toward the flap of the tent. The faintest glimmer of movement caught her attention. Two glowing eyes staring at her from the edge of the woods. She froze. The eyes blinked slowly, as though studying her, and then the creature moved, slowly, methodically. It was no longer hiding in the trees. It was coming closer, its massive form casting a shadow against the tent. Every step it took sent vibrations through the ground, and she could feel the weight of it in the air. Her chest tightened with fear. Every step it took sent vibrations through the ground, and she could feel the weight of it in the air. Her chest tightened with fear. Jake must have sensed something, for he finally sat up, rubbing his eyes. He was groggy, but there was an edge of panic creeping in as he finally noticed the tension in her face. The growl rumbled again, closer, more deafening now, and Emily's blood ran cold. It wasn't just a bear, it was something else. Jake looked over his shoulder at the flap of the tent, his brow furrowed.
Is it the wind again?
Emily breathed, shaking her head.
This isn't the wind. There's something out there, something huge.
Before Jake could say anything else, the growl came again, louder and more distinct this time. It was a deep, resonating sound that sent chills up their spines. A massive, black shape suddenly lunged at the tent, tearing through the canvas with a force that made the entire structure collapse inward. Emily screamed, her hands instinctively reaching for Jake as the dark shape loomed over them. The beast's claws scraped across the fabric, its snarls rattling the very air around them. Emily could feel the ground shake beneath her as the creature's weight pressed against the tent, its breath hot and foul. And then, as the darkness seemed to envelop them, Emily's last thought was that it wasn't just a bear. It wasn't an animal at all. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her entire body frozen in place. The thing outside the tent was no longer a distant sound. It was here, right on top of them. The growls, deep and guttural, rumbled through the ground like thunder. The heavy weight of the creature pressed against the fabric of the tent, the tension of its massive form almost unbearable. Her heart raced, each beat louder than the last, echoing in her ears. She could hear the scrape of claws against the canvas, the beast's long, twisted nails tearing through the material as though it was nothing more than paper. She could feel the pulse of its presence, the heat of its breath wafting through the small openings in the tent. It was a suffocating, primal force.
Jake!
Emily's voice was a hoarse whisper, barely audible over the growing chaos outside. She shook him desperately, but he was still frozen, wide-eyed and shocked.
Jake, we need to move now!
He didn't respond at first, his eyes flicking toward the door of the tent. His face was pale, and for a moment, she could see the same fear she felt reflected in his eyes. Then, as if snapping back into reality, he grabbed the flashlight and swung it toward the entrance, his hands trembling. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it was no use. The shadows outside were too thick, the creature too close. All they could see was the dim, looming shape of something massive, the faintest outline of glowing eyes, reflecting back at them. But that wasn't what caught their attention. The growl became more intense, a low, vibrating sound that filled their bones. And then, silence. Emily's breath hitched. The beast had stopped moving. They sat in the oppressive stillness for what felt like an eternity, the air heavy with the weight of impending doom. Emily's heartbeat pounded in her ears. She could feel her skin prickling with terror, and despite every instinct telling her to flee, she couldn't move. She could only wait for whatever was outside to strike. Then, the silence shattered, A loud, deafening rip tore through the fabric of the tent. The side wall buckled inward, and for a split second, Emily saw a flash of movement. A monstrous shadow, towering and dark, clawing its way inside. The beast's roar was deafening, its mouth stretching open in a sickening grimace. Emily's instincts screamed at her to run, but it was already too late. The claws tore through the tent like a hot knife through butter, and the first swipe was enough to knock Jake off his feet. He let out a choked scream, the flashlight clattering to the ground as he was thrown back, the side of his face slashed open. Blood splattered the tent, the smell of it mingling with the rancid stench of the creature outside. Emily's body moved of its own accord. She lunged toward the tear in the tent, pushing Jake behind her as she scrambled to get out. But she wasn't fast enough. The creature's massive paw shot through the opening, slamming into her chest with an unnatural force. She cried out, the air knocked out of her lungs as she was sent flying backward into the tent. Her back hit the hard ground, the earth cold and unyielding beneath her. The beast loomed over her, its eyes glowing in the darkness. It wasn't a bear. It was something much worse. Its body was hulking, twisted, and covered in matted fur that seemed to shift unnaturally in the low light. Its snout was long and twisted, full of jagged, yellowed teeth that gleamed with hunger. Jake's cries echoed in the background, but they seemed distant, muffled, as if the world had become a hollow place. Emily could only focus on the thing standing above her, on the terror consuming her entire being. Her limbs refused to move, the paralysis of fear wrapping around her like chains, and then the creature moved. Its mouth opened wide, its breath hot and fetid as it lunged forward, sinking its teeth into her shoulder. The pain was excruciating, a sharp burn that spread through her body like fire. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed up by the relentless growls and crunching of her flesh beneath the beast's teeth. Her vision blurred, and her thoughts began to fragment. The world was spinning, distorting in a haze of pain and fear. She tried to push against the beast, her hands uselessly clawing at its thick fur, but it was no use. The creature's jaws tightened around her, and her body was pulled, twisted, and ripped apart by the force. The last thing she saw was Jake, his face contorted in agony, trying to crawl toward her, but he was too slow. His body jerked violently as the beast swung its massive claws toward him. He barely had time to scream before the claws tore into his side, ripping open his ribs. He let out a desperate cry, his eyes meeting hers just before the world around them went dark. And then, silence. The forest was quiet again. The sounds of the beast's ferocious attack had faded, replaced by an unnatural stillness. Emily's body lay motionless on the forest floor, torn and broken, her chest rising and falling with shallow, labored breaths. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood, mingling with the foul odor of decay. The ground was slick beneath her, slick with blood and the remnants of a nightmare. Her vision was blurred, her body broken, but her mind refused to let go of the fragments of horror that had torn through the night. She could still hear the growls, distant now but unmistakably real, rattling the trees. The creature's presence hung in the air, like a suffocating shadow that pressed down on her chest. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear Jake. His voice, so faint, so distant, reached her ears, but it was no longer a cry for help. No, it had become something else, something guttural, something primal. It was the sound of someone who knew the end was near. Emily tried to lift her head, her neck protesting the movement, but she couldn't. She felt cold, the warmth of the life she had left draining away, seeping into the ground beneath her. Her fingers twitched, the only movement she could muster. A wet, sticky sensation coated her hand as it touched the earth, and she realized with a terrible certainty that it was her own blood. Her thoughts blurred in and out of focus, her mind unable to keep up with the horror unfolding. The growls grew louder again, a low rumble in the distance, sending a shiver through her body. The forest seemed to breathe with it, the trees swaying as though in time with the beast's movements. She forced her eyes open, trying to make sense of the world around her, but all she could see was a blurry, dark landscape where shadows seemed to move of their own accord. The world felt as though it was collapsing in on itself, the night thickening, pulling tighter with each passing moment. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was Jake, bloodied and broken, dragging himself across the ground. His face was pale, his clothes torn, but his eyes were wide with something primal, something that no longer resembled the man she had known. It was a look of terror, of defeat, of a soul broken beyond repair. He reached out to her, his hand trembling as it hovered just inches from her own. But then something stopped him, something unseen, something that wasn't of this world. Emily's breath hitched, her chest tightening as she watched Jake struggle to move closer. His face twisted in pain, but he continued to crawl toward her, his movements slow, deliberate. His mouth opened, but no words came out, just a hoarse, gurgling sound, like a dying animal. His eyes were locked on hers, pleading for help, but there was nothing she could do. The darkness was closing in, swallowing him, swallowing them both. The air thickened with a sickly, rancid stench, and suddenly, Emily could see it, the creature. It loomed above them, its massive, hulking form blocking out the few remaining slivers of light from the moon. The eyes, glowing, feral, fixed on them with predatory intent. The growls were deafening now, so close they vibrated through the ground beneath them. Jake's eyes darted up, and he saw it too. His face drained of color, his body shaking uncontrollably. He tried to move, but the creature's clawed hand shot out with blinding speed, pinning him to the ground. His screams were silenced almost instantly, as the beast's jaws closed around his throat, snapping his head back with a sickening crack. Emily wanted to scream, but her voice was gone. She couldn't move. Her body refused to obey, her mind trapped in a haze of terror and pain. The creature tore into Jake with brutal efficiency, the sounds of his suffering mingling with the rending of flesh, the snapping of bone. Blood splattered across the ground, painting the earth in a dark, twisted pattern. Emily could do nothing but watch in horrified disbelief, her heart hammering in her chest as she was forced to witness the brutal end of the man she had once loved. It felt like hours, though only minutes passed, before the creature stopped. Its glowing eyes turned toward her, and in that moment, she knew. She was next. There was no escape. No more hope. Emily could now see the beast in all its entirety. Its fur, once rich and brown, now hung in filthy, matted clumps, bleached pale and streaked with dark, crusted stains of blood. Patches of flesh were missing, exposing raw muscle and splintered bone beneath. Its eyes glowed an unnatural, sickly yellow, burning with a mindless hunger. The beast's jaws opened wide, dripping with the remnants of Jake's blood. Its massive form loomed over her, its fur matted with the gore of its kill. It snarled, a low, rumbling growl that shook the trees around them. It was savoring the moment, relishing in its victory. Emily's body was a broken thing, and her mind, her thoughts, were slipping further away, lost to the overwhelming terror. She couldn't fight back. She couldn't even scream. The creature leaned closer, its breath hot and foul as it towered over her, and she realized, with terrifying clarity, that this was it. This was the end. The cold, empty nothingness that awaited them both. And then, the darkness closed in. The forest was dead now. No wind, no birdsong, no sound but the soft drip of blood onto pine needles, like a cruel metronome ticking off the final moments of something sacred now forever broken. The campfire had long since died, the ashes cold, scattered by the chaos that had come like a storm in the night. All that remained was ruin, a crushed tent, blood-darkened earth, and the twisted remains of what had once been two lovers, now nothing more than silence and gore. The beast had not left. It loomed just beyond the trees, its breath still visible in the early dawn mist, steaming from its gaping maw like smoke from a smoldering furnace. Its eyes, two pale orbs of ghostly fire, watched the ruins it had created, not with hunger anymore, but something worse. Satisfaction. Beneath it, Jake's body lay torn open, unrecognizable, limbs at unnatural angles. His chest a hollowed cavity. His blood had painted the trunks of nearby trees. His entrails glistened like some horrific offering to a god that should never have existed. The creature had not devoured all of him. It had taken its time, savored the fear. Emily's body, now still and broken, was slumped over a torn section of the tent. Her eyes, wide, glassy, and forever locked in the moment of her death, reflected the pale light of the moon, now dipping below the horizon. Her mouth was open in a silent scream. Her face had been spared the worst of it, as if the beast had wanted Jake to see her terror before it finished him. But something stirred in that silence. Not wind, not life, something else. From the trees, the air rippled. The scent of blood was thick, but beneath it something older rose. A deep, damp rot, the kind of smell that lives in the soil of graveyards, that clings to the stones of forgotten tombs. The trees began to creak as if groaning under a weight they couldn't carry. The shadows thickened, lengthening unnaturally, and the beast, so mighty, so unstoppable, twitched, its ears flattened. It sniffed the air. It felt it too, a presence, something watching it. Suddenly the creature's breath hitched. Its glowing eyes darted through the trees. There was something else now in the forest, something not born of flesh and fur, something colder. The beast backed away a step, a deep growl rumbling from its chest, but not in rage this time, in fear. A shape moved between the trees. Its face was hidden beneath something like a veil, something that shimmered not with light, but with absence, like it wore a piece of the void itself. No footsteps sounded, but with every flicker of wind, it drew closer. The beast shrieked, a terrible sound that tore through the morning like a blade. It turned to flee, claws carving deep gouges in the soil as it tried to escape the thing approaching. But it was already too late. The air bent around the figure as it raised a long, skeletal hand, black as coal, fingers stretched and twitching. From its palm came a pulse, a soundless wave of death that struck the beast mid-step. The monster froze, its limbs convulsed. Its mouth opened in a guttural, panicked howl. It dropped to the ground like a collapsed marionette, twitching, clawing, its glowing eyes dimming. And then, silence again. The figure stood over the remains of the creature, as if judging its kill. It turned, slowly, and walked back into the trees, fading with the mist. When the search party arrived 3 days later, they found what was left of Jake and Emily. The rangers were hardened men, but none of them could keep from retching. The scene was indescribable. Shredded bodies, claw marks that cut through stone, blood soaked into the roots of the trees so deep it would never wash out. The official report would say, "Bear attack." A freak incident, but the tracker, an old man with more years in the wild than any of them, stood apart, pale and silent, staring into the forest with wide eyes. When asked what was wrong, he didn't reply, but he gave the impression he knew what turned the beautiful, tranquil forest into a place of blood and death. The trail was then closed forever, but those who know the woods say, if you camp too deep, where the trees grow too close and the light never touches the ground, you might hear breathing that doesn't belong to anything alive. You might see eyes that reflect nothing, and if you do, don't run. It remembers. It always remembers. Thank you for listening to Whispers in the Dark. If you'd like to support the show, head over to our Patreon where you can sign up to one of 3 different tiers. Or if you'd prefer to make a one-off contribution, maybe you'd like to buy me a coffee. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook and YouTube to stay up to date with new episodes, behind-the-scenes content, and more chilling tales. And remember, you've heard the whispers, but some doors, once opened, never truly close. If you feel something watching tonight, don't look back. We'll see you next time, if the dark lets you go.